Something that nobody in Washington wants you to sit with long enough to fully understand is this. A nation under active bombardment has now launched over 3,100 separate strikes across the entire Gulf region, hitting 17 American military installations, and the conflict has barely crossed 2 weeks. This is not a headline. This is a restructuring of the entire strategic map of the Middle East, happening in real time right now, while most Americans are being handed fragments of a much larger story. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes against Iran, openly stating their goals included regime change and the dismantling of Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile capabilities. What followed was not a collapse. What followed was a methodical, wave-by-wave counter-offensive that reached across borders in ways the architects of this war apparently did not fully wargame. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps declared that all U.S. military assets throughout the region are considered legitimate targets and that the operation would continue relentlessly until the enemy is decisively defeated. Those are not the words of a broken regime. Those are the words of a state that decided, regardless of the cost, it would not absorb these blows in silence. Iran's newly appointed supreme leader has since issued a direct ultimatum: attacks on U.S. military assets will not stop unless every base hosting American forces in the region is closed. Meanwhile, a vessel is ablaze in the Strait of Hormuz, the single corridor through which a significant portion of the world's oil supply moves every single day. The global energy system is not watching this from a safe distance, it is inside the fire. Now let me think about what happened and where this is going. On the very first day of Iran's counteroffensive, Iran fired 137 missiles and 209 drones across the UAE alone, with fires and smoke visible from some of Dubai's most iconic landmarks, the Palm Jumeirah and the Burj Al Arab. Sit with that for a moment, not in some obscure desert border town, not in an anonymous stretch of open water. Right there, in one of the most commercially active, globally connected cities on the planet, the skies lit up with projectiles on a scale that no one broadcasting on American television fully stopped to explain to you. Dubai's airport, the world's busiest for international passenger traffic, was hit. Kuwait's airport was also struck, and at Abu Dhabi's airport, at least one person was killed and 7 others were wounded. These are not military installations in a remote province. These are the airports that move goods, capital, executives, and energy contracts across the entire global economy every single hour of every single day. And they were inside the conflict zone, not near it, inside it. By March 3rd, Iran had fired 174 ballistic missiles at the UAE alone, launched 689 drones, and sent 8 cruise missiles into the country. The UAE's air defenses intercepted most of them, but here is the part that tends to get glossed over in the summary headlines. Interception is not a clean process. Debris from intercepted drones and missiles fell onto populated neighborhoods in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, killing civilians and injuring dozens more. Shrapnel does not ask for a passport. It does not distinguish between military and civilian. It lands where physics takes it, and in a city as densely built and internationally populated as Dubai, that means ordinary people, construction workers, hotel staff, airport employees, became casualties in a war that Washington told everyone would be swift, decisive, and contained. The civilians killed in the UAE were foreign nationals from Pakistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh. These are the invisible labor force that built the skyline you see in every Dubai tourism video. They had no seat at the table when the decision to launch this war was made. They had no voice in the strategic calculations that placed American bases inside the cities where they work. And now they are dead. That is a fact that deserves far more than a footnote. What is also critical to understand here is the geography of American military presence in this region, because it is the entire reason this conflict spread across 6 countries simultaneously. Thousands of U.S. soldiers are deployed in the oil and gas-rich Arab states lying just across the Gulf from Iran. The U.S. military does not have one base in this theater. It does not have 2 or 3. It has a deeply embedded, multi-country network of installations that stretches from Kuwait to Qatar to Bahrain to Saudi Arabia to the UAE and beyond. The IRGC said it was carrying out retaliatory attacks on 27 military bases where U.S. soldiers are deployed. Iran did not invent that list. The United States built it over decades, and when the bombs started falling on Tehran, every single one of those installations became a declared target. Saudi Arabia's Prince Sultan Air Base, which hosts U.S. troops, was targeted with 6 ballistic missiles on a single day in early March. Qatar's Al Udeid military base, where U.S. forces are stationed, was struck by 2 ballistic missiles, while a drone targeted an early warning radar installation at the same facility. These are not proxy strikes. These are direct attacks on the forward operating infrastructure of the United States military, and they are happening with a frequency and scale that the American public is simply not being prepared for in any meaningful way. The U.S. military confirmed 11 fatalities from Iranian attacks across the region. 7 soldiers were dead within the first week alone. A U.S. Air Force refueling aircraft crashed in Iraq on March 13th, with all 6 crew members confirmed dead, making it the 4th U.S. aircraft lost during this war. 4 aircraft in 2 weeks, 11 American soldiers dead. That is the number being reported right now. And there is a long history in American conflicts of early reported numbers being revised significantly upward as the fog clears and the full accounting comes in. There is something else happening here that is being dramatically underreported, and it has to do with the economic architecture of the Gulf itself. Despite Iran's insistence that it has only targeted military assets, its attacks have also struck critical energy infrastructure, particularly oil facilities, as well as military bases in neighboring countries. Iranian drones and debris have hit civilian infrastructure across the Gulf, including airports in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, as well as hotels and residential buildings. Now, the reason this matters for Americans watching from home is not abstract. The Gulf is not simply a region of geopolitical interest. It is a critical node in the global energy supply chain. It is where a massive share of the world's oil and gas moves through on its way to Europe, Asia, and beyond. When the infrastructure inside that system starts taking direct hits on a daily basis, the price of everything that runs on energy begins to move, and everything runs on energy. Analysts say Iran's strategy has aimed to create maximum discomfort for its immediate neighbors, as well as showing that Tehran can shake the global economy and disrupt oil markets and pressure those Gulf states, anxious to protect their diversifying economies, to exert pressure on the US. That is a sophisticated geopolitical calculation. It is not the behavior of a regime in the final stages of collapse. It is the behavior of a state that, even under sustained bombardment, retains the capability and the strategic coherence to fight on multiple dimensions at once. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, appointed after the killing of his father, issued his first public statement making clear that attacks on Israel and US military assets in the Middle East would continue unless all bases hosting US forces in the region are closed. That is an ultimatum, a real one. Not a press release, not diplomatic language designed to leave room for negotiation. It is a stated military and political condition, and the condition is one that the United States cannot simply accept without fundamentally reshaping its entire strategic posture in the Middle East, a posture built over the better part of 4 decades. On March 1st, Trump announced that the US had accepted an Iranian proposal to enter further negotiations, and later stated in an interview that US operations were to be completed within a 4-week timetable. 4 weeks. That is the timeline that was placed on a military operation targeting a nation-state with a population of nearly 90 million people, a deeply entrenched military-industrial structure, and decades of experience operating under extreme external pressure. What that timetable does not account for is what happens when the 4 weeks end and the strategic objectives have not been met. Because they have not been met, Iran's strikes are ongoing. The Strait of Hormuz remains under pressure. Shipping has been affected. Regional oil and gas production has been cut. The objective of forcing regime change or fully dismantling Iran's nuclear and missile capabilities within a 4-week window was, from the very first day, a plan built on assumptions that did not survive contact with the actual country being bombed. The US military said on March 11th that it destroyed 16 mine-laying vessels near the Strait of Hormuz, after President Trump warned Iran to immediately remove any mines from the vital shipping waterway. Mines in the Strait of Hormuz. That is a level of threat to global shipping that has not existed in this form since the 1980s tanker wars. By March 12th, the United Kingdom Maritime Trade Operations had received reports of 16 attacks on shipping in the Persian Gulf since the start of hostilities. The sea lanes that carry the world's energy are under active military pressure right now, in real time, as you watch this video. That is not alarmism, that is the operational picture as it currently exists. The International Energy Agency announced on March 12th that member countries would release a record amount of oil from their strategic reserves as fighting in the Middle East caused major disruptions to energy markets. A record release, not a precautionary measure, not a signal, a record release, triggered by actual market disruption from an actual shooting war in the single most energy-critical waterway on Earth. The price mechanism is already speaking, even if the political conversation in Washington has not fully caught up with what the markets are registering. Iran's counterstrikes on Arab Gulf states, countries that have actually sought to deepen relations with Iran in recent years, may leave it further isolated regionally. That is a real cost. Qatar's prime minister and foreign minister strongly condemned Iranian attacks and said Tehran's justifications were totally rejected. The Gulf Cooperation Council has issued statements describing Iran's attacks as treacherous. Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE have threatened to retaliate against Iran, though they have stopped short of potentially escalatory action for now. Those two words carry an enormous amount of weight, because if any Gulf state makes the decision to move from threatened retaliation to actual retaliation, the conflict ceases to be a US-Israel-Iran war and becomes a full regional conflagration of a kind that no one, not Washington, not Riyadh, not Brussels, has a clear plan for managing. Spain denied the use of its military bases for US flights connected to the offensive against Iran, leading President Trump to threaten economic retaliation. That is a fracture inside the Western alliance architecture. A NATO member state publicly refusing to allow its territory to be used for this war and being threatened economically for that refusal. That is not a small diplomatic footnote. That is the kind of crack that tends to widen as a conflict drags on, especially when the early stated timetable slips and the justifications used to sell the war begin to collide with the reality on the ground. Iranian and Lebanese health officials and Israeli authorities have reported more than 200 people killed in Iran and 634 in Lebanon. And then there is the incident that demands its own moment of reflection. The US military is currently investigating how it fired a Tomahawk missile at an Iranian girls' school in Era. The March 1st strike killed as many as 175 people, most of them students, according to Iranian officials. 175 people, most of them children, in a girls' school, killed by an American Tomahawk missile on the very first day of the war. That is not a talking point. That is not Iranian propaganda. That is an active investigation being conducted by the United States military itself, conducted because they cannot yet explain how this happened. And whatever the investigation eventually concludes, the fact of those 175 deaths is already embedded in the consciousness of 1.5 billion people across the Muslim world, and it will shape the politics of this conflict and the politics of the region long after the last missile wave of this particular phase has been launched. The United Nations Security Council passed a resolution calling for Iran to stop its attacks on Gulf states and condemning it for breaking international law, while notably not mentioning the US-Israel strikes on Iran, which are widely considered illegal under international law as a violation of the UN Charter's prohibition on the use of force. That asymmetry, condemning the response while not addressing the act that triggered it, is precisely the kind of institutional double standard that accelerates the erosion of the rules-based order that Western governments claim to be defending. When the rules only seem to apply to one side, the rules stop functioning as rules and start functioning as tools of the powerful. And when that happens, the countries that have been on the receiving end of those rules begin to draw their own conclusions about what the international system actually is and what it is actually for. The Houthis in Yemen, who had suspended their Red Sea operations since October 2025 following a Gaza peace proposal, have now restarted their threats in the Gulf of Aden and Red Sea. The pause is over. The ceasefire logic that had briefly quieted one of the most disruptive maritime threat vectors of the past 2 years has now collapsed back into the conflict's gravity. Security sources claim the Houthis are planning incursions into the Arabian Sea and may also use bases on the African side of the Red Sea, helped by cells established in East Africa. If that materializes, the geographic scope of this conflict will have expanded from the Persian Gulf into the Red Sea and potentially into the Indian Ocean shipping lanes, meaning virtually every major maritime trade route connecting Asia, the Middle East, Europe, and East Africa would be operating under some degree of active threat. That is an extraordinary statement to have to make about the current state of global commerce, and yet here we are. On March 13th, the US temporarily lifted restrictions on the sale of Russian oil to help deal with the economic costs of the war. Let that land. After years of sanctions, after the entire Western sanctions architecture built around punishing Russia for its actions in Ukraine, the United States, in the middle of its own shooting war with Iran, quietly lifted restrictions on Russian oil sales to manage the economic blowback from a conflict it started. This is the kind of decision that reveals the true constraints operating beneath the surface of official policy, Sanctions are powerful until they aren't. Stated principles hold until the economic pressure becomes too great to sustain, and what the markets and the energy system are registering right now is pressure of a kind that does not respond neatly to press conferences or 4-week timetables. The preliminary death toll stands at 1,444 dead in Iran, at least 15 in Israel, 11 US soldiers killed, and 19 dead in Gulf states. Those numbers will move. They always do. But even at these early figures, what they represent is the human cost of a strategic decision, made in Washington and Jerusalem, to resolve through force what years of diplomacy could not resolve through negotiation. And the people paying that cost are not the people who made that decision. They are students in girls' schools in Tehran. They are migrant workers in Dubai. They are sailors on oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz. They are American service members stationed at bases whose names most Americans have never heard, in countries most Americans could not place on a map, defending a strategic position whose logic was designed for a world that may already be changing faster than the strategy can keep up with.